The Spilled Coffee. The morning rush at Brood Beginnings was in full swing when Nora Patterson glanced at the clock for the fifth time. 6 hours down, 4 more to go on her double shift. Her fingers ached from operating the espresso machine non-stop since dawn, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Every tip, every extra hour mattered. "Grande caramel macchiato for Jessica," she called out with practiced cheerfulness, sliding the cup across the counter. Behind her smile lurked calculations. How many more shifts until she could pay the next installment of her grandmother's care facility bill? How many more months until she could afford a new lens for her camera? At 26, Nora's life was an exercise in balance. By day, she memorized coffee orders and perfected latte art. By night, she edited the wildlife photographs she captured during precious stolen moments at dawn in the city park. Her small apartment wall was covered with her prints. Birds in flight, foxes darting between trees, the secret life of the urban ecosystem captured through her lens. "Nora, can you handle the line?" "I need to restock the pastry case," her co-worker Delia called over the din of the crowded cafe. "Got it," Nora replied, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear as she turned to the next customer. The morning continued in a blur of orders until the door chimed and a tall figure in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit entered. Even before he removed his sunglasses, something about his confident stride made several patrons turn to look. Thomas Reed wasn't famous in the traditional sense, but in the business world of Pittsburgh, he was something of a legend. The 34-year-old founder of Ecotech Innovations, who had revolutionized sustainable architecture in the city. Nora, however, saw only another customer as she balanced 3 cups while reaching for a 4th. "I'll be right with you, sir," she called, not looking up. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As she pivoted, her elbow caught the edge of an open milk carton. It tipped, she lunged to catch it, and the tray of prepared drinks tilted precariously in her other hand. The inevitable collision occurred precisely as Thomas Reed stepped up to the counter. Coffee cascaded down the front of his suit. Not just any coffee, but a venti dark roast with an extra shot. The cafe fell silent. Nora froze, horror flooding her face as she watched the dark stain spread across what she was certain was a suit that cost more than she made in 3 months. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, grabbing napkins frantically. "I'm so incredibly sorry." She expected anger, perhaps even demands to speak to the manager. Instead, Thomas Reed looked down at his ruined suit and then at Nora's mortified expression and did something unexpected. He laughed. "Well," he said, his voice warm with amusement, "I'd say this suit was due for retirement anyway." Nora blinked in confusion. "I can pay for the dry cleaning," she offered, knowing full well such a promise would mean skipping meals for a week. Thomas waved away her offer. "Please, don't worry about it. Accidents happen." His eyes caught sight of something behind the counter, a photograph taped to the wall. It showed a red fox, perfectly illuminated in morning light, its expression captured in a moment of curious assessment of the photographer. "Did you take that?" he asked, nodding toward the image. Surprised by the question, Nora nodded. "Yes, in Frick Park. I photograph wildlife when I can." "You're very talented," Thomas said, studying the image with genuine interest. "Do you have other work?" The unexpected compliment brought warmth to her cheeks. "Thank you." "Yes, I do. It's just a hobby, though." "Sometimes hobbies are what we're actually meant to do," he replied thoughtfully. Then, glancing back at his coffee-stained suit, he smiled again. "Since I'm apparently not dressed for my next meeting anymore, how about I order that coffee to stay instead of to go?" For the next hour, as the morning rush subsided, Thomas Reed sat by the window, occasionally glancing at Nora as she worked. When she finally took her break, he surprised her by inviting her to join him. More surprising still was his invitation to a charity gala that weekend, an environmental fundraiser hosted by his company. "I can't possibly," Nora began, but Thomas interrupted gently. "Your fox photograph tells me you care about wildlife. This gala is raising money for urban habitat preservation. Come as my guest. No pressure, just an evening supporting a good cause." As Nora hesitated, weighing all the reasons she should decline against the unexpected connection she felt with this stranger. She had no way of knowing that this spilled coffee would change the course of both their lives. Whispers at the Gala. The Weston Museum of Art transformed into a glittering wonderland for Ecotech's annual charity gala. Crystal chandeliers cast diamond-like reflections across marble floors where Pittsburgh's elite gathered in designer evening wear, champagne flutes in hand, checkbooks at the ready for the evening's auction benefiting urban wildlife conservation. Nora stood at the entrance, heart hammering against her ribs. She'd spent 3 days' tips on renting a simple emerald dress, nothing compared to the couture surrounding her, but the best she could manage. Her grandmother's vintage pearl earrings and her own talent with makeup completed the illusion that she belonged. "You came." Thomas's voice was warm with genuine pleasure as he approached. In his tailored tuxedo, he looked even more imposing than he had in the coffee shop. Yet his eyes held the same kind interest that had disarmed her days earlier. "I almost didn't," Nora admitted, accepting the champagne he offered. "I've never been to anything like this." "Then they're the ones missing out," Thomas replied, gently guiding her into the room with a light touch at her elbow. "The photographer in you will appreciate the exhibit they've opened for tonight. Come." As they moved through the crowd, Nora couldn't help noticing the glances, some curious, some appraising, some openly disapproving. Thomas greeted various guests, introducing Nora simply as a talented wildlife photographer, which felt both generous and misleading given her amateur status. They paused before a striking photograph of a snow leopard, its crystalline eyes hauntingly direct. Nora was so captivated she didn't notice the approach of a small group until a woman's voice, deliberately loud, cut through their conversation. "Thomas, darling, what a surprise to see you with company. The woman, Vanessa Harrington," as Thomas reluctantly introduced her, wore a diamond necklace that probably cost more than Nora's grandmother's medical bills for a year. Her smile didn't reach her calculating eyes. "We so rarely see you with guests at these functions." "Nora was kind enough to join me in supporting the cause," Thomas replied neutrally. Vanessa tilted her head. "And what is it you do, Nora? Something in Thomas's industry?" "I'm a barista, actually," Nora answered honestly, lifting her chin slightly, "at Brood Beginnings downtown." The subtle shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Eyebrows raised fractionally. Glances exchanged. Someone in the group smothered a laugh with a poorly disguised cough. "How quaint," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I suppose everyone needs their morning coffee." She turned to the gentleman beside her. "Remember that phase when Elizabeth's daughter thought working in service would be character building before law school? Lasted all of 2 weeks. Some of us," another woman added with a theatrical whisper, "actually had to work through college, though typically not as something so visible." Each comment landed like tiny arrows against Nora's skin. She'd anticipated judgment, but not this casual cruelty masquerading as conversation. Thomas's hand tightened slightly on his champagne flute, but before he could respond, Vanessa delivered her final assessment. "Well, Thomas has always been charitable. I suppose this evening he's extending that beyond just writing checks." Heat flooded Nora's face. She stepped back, ready to excuse herself and flee, when Thomas set his glass down with deliberate care on a passing waiter's tray. "Actually, Vanessa," his voice was quiet but carried with precision, "I invited Nora because, unlike many in this room, she doesn't just talk about appreciating nature. She's up at dawn capturing its beauty while most of us are still asleep. Her work shows more genuine commitment to what we're supposedly celebrating tonight than half the board members who'll pose for photos later." He turned slightly, addressing the stunned group. "As for charity, if serving others is something you consider beneath you, perhaps you've misunderstood the entire purpose of tonight's event. We're here to serve something greater than ourselves. Nora does that every day, with more grace than I'm currently demonstrating." The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa's perfect smile had frozen in place. "If you'll excuse us," Thomas continued, offering his arm to Nora. "I promised to show her the conservation exhibit." As they walked away, Nora struggled to process what had just happened. No one had ever defended her like that, certainly not at the expense of their own social comfort. "You didn't need to do that," she whispered when they were out of earshot. "I'm used to people making assumptions." Thomas stopped, turning to face her fully. "That doesn't make it acceptable. And I meant every word." His expression softened. "I'm sorry that happened. Why did you really invite me tonight?" Nora asked suddenly. "Was it pity? Because I spilled coffee on you?" Thomas considered her question carefully. "I invited you because in the 15 minutes we spoke at the cafe, you showed more passion for wildlife than I've heard from professional conservationists. And because," he hesitated, "when you talked about capturing that fox photo, waiting 3 hours in the cold for the perfect moment, you reminded me of something I've been missing." The honesty in his voice disarmed her completely. Before she could respond, the museum director approached, eager to introduce Thomas to a potential donor. The moment shattered, but something had fundamentally shifted between them. Later, during the auction, Thomas bid an astronomical amount on a wildlife photography expedition package, winning it handily. As applause filled the room, he quietly handed the certificate to Nora. "I can't accept this," she protested, staring at the paper that promised 2 weeks photographing endangered species alongside a renowned conservationist. "Consider it an investment," he replied, "in someone who already sees what the rest of us are trying to save." Under the glittering chandeliers, surrounded by wealth and privilege she couldn't begin to imagine possessing, Nora felt for the first time that perhaps her passion wasn't just a hobby to squeeze between shifts. Perhaps it was something worth pursuing, something that had value beyond what she'd allowed herself to believe. And in Thomas's eyes, she glimpsed something unexpected, not the pity she'd feared, nor the charitable impulse Vanessa had cruelly suggested, but genuine respect. That, more than the certificate in her hands, felt like the true gift of the evening. Behind the wealth rain lashed against the windows of Thomas's downtown office, 40 floors above the city where lights blurred into watercolor streaks. Nora stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass, camera in hand, capturing the storm's drama while Thomas finished a conference call in the adjoining room. 3 weeks had passed. Since the gala, 3 weeks of unexpected friendship that still felt surreal to Nora. She'd agreed to meet him today ostensibly to discuss the upcoming photography expedition he'd gifted her, but their conversations had a way of meandering into unexpected territory. "Sorry about that," Thomas said, entering the room and loosening his tie. "Investors get nervous when quarterly reports are due." Nora lowered her camera. "I can imagine. Though actually I can't really imagine at all," she admitted with a small laugh. "Your world is still completely foreign to me. Would you like a tour?" Thomas gestured toward a modest doorway she hadn't noticed before. "The real ecotech, not the glossy version we show visitors." Curious, Nora followed him through the door and down a utilitarian hallway that stood in stark contrast to the sleek reception area. They entered a vast space filled with workbenches, prototypes, and engineers in casual clothing rather than suits. Models of buildings, solar arrays, and water reclamation systems covered every available surface. "This is where the actual work happens," Thomas explained, his entire demeanor shifting as he moved through the space. Here, among half-finished projects and whiteboards covered in calculations, he seemed more alive than in the executive suite. "The suits upstairs talk about profit margins. These people talk about how many tons of carbon we can offset or how many gallons of water we can conserve." As they toured the facility, Thomas greeted every employee by name, asking about specific projects and occasionally about their families. There was none of the reverence she'd observed at the gala. These interactions were marked by easy camaraderie and shared purpose. "You're different here," Nora observed as they paused beside a miniature urban farm system being developed for food deserts. "More yourself somehow," Thomas smiled ruefully. "Perceptive. I spend more time in boardrooms than I'd like these days." He picked up a small component, turning it thoughtfully in his hands. "Did you know I started Ecotech in my cousin's garage? We were just 2 engineering students with more ideas than money." "I assumed you came from—" Nora hesitated. "Old money?" Thomas finished with a knowing look. "Not even close. My mother cleaned hotel rooms. My father drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. College was scholarships and 3 part-time jobs. They continued walking, and Thomas pointed out a faded photograph on the wall amid the patents and awards, a much younger version of himself standing beside a rudimentary solar collection system, clothes stained with grease, dark circles under triumphant eyes. Year 1. I was sleeping on a cot in that garage, showering at the YMCA, and eating ramen for every meal. Had to choose between paying my phone bill or buying parts that month. Nora studied the photograph with new understanding. What changed? How did you go from that to... She gestured vaguely at the empire around them. Persistence, luck, and learning to navigate rooms I wasn't born to be in, Thomas answered, his expression growing distant. The hardest part wasn't developing the technology. It was convincing people who summer in the Hamptons to take seriously a kid who pronounced entrepreneurial wrong in his first pitch meeting. They made their way to a small break room where Thomas prepared coffee with the same precision Nora recognized from her own training. No assistance, no pretension, just practiced movements. May I ask why you did? Learn to navigate those rooms, I mean, Nora said, accepting the mug he offered. Thomas considered her question. Because I believed the work mattered more than my discomfort. Environmental solutions needed funding, and the funding was in those rooms. He smiled slightly, though I still hate the galas. Could have fooled me, Nora replied. You seem perfectly at ease. Practice, Thomas corrected. Not comfort. There's a difference. As they returned to his office, Thomas paused before a wall covered in Nora's photographs, prints she'd shared with him over recent weeks that he'd had professionally framed. Seeing her work displayed so prominently in his space made something catch in her throat. These remind me why I started Ecotech, he said quietly. Not the technology itself, but what we're trying to preserve. Impulsively, Nora handed him her camera. Here, I want to show you something. She guided him through her recent photographs, explaining her techniques, the hours spent waiting for perfect light, the research into animal behaviors. Thomas listened with genuine fascination, asking questions that revealed how closely he'd been paying attention to her previous explanations. You have an extraordinary gift, he said finally, returning the camera. This isn't just a hobby, Nora. This is art with purpose. The rain had stopped, and late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting the office in amber light. In that moment, Nora saw Thomas clearly, not as the wealthy entrepreneur or the social elite, but as someone who had built his life from nothing, driven by convictions similar to her own. Why did you really invite me here today? She asked, echoing her question from the gala. Thomas met her gaze directly. Because I wanted to show you that where we start doesn't have to determine where we end up. And because... He hesitated, then continued with careful honesty. I find myself wanting to share parts of my life I don't usually show people. The admission hung between them, fragile and significant. Nora realized that despite all the external differences in their circumstances, they recognized something essential in each other, a shared understanding that transcended their disparate worlds.